Parliament to talk about that. Mark Miller is a Liberal MP and the Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Indigenous Services. Michael Cooper is the Justice Critic for the official opposition and a member of the Commons Justice Committee. And Daniel Blakey is a Vice Critic on Ethics for the NDP and was at the Justice Committee meeting today as well. So, Mr. Miller, let's talk about the SNC Lavalin investigation and whether Parliament has a role to keep probing this story. Given what we heard today and the evidence from Jerry Butts and those text messages between he and Jody Wilson-Raybould, is there a reason to have this continue, or are you suggesting, as Liberals have, that enough's been said here, it's time to move on?
Well, Peter, cognizant of the fact that this is something that committee will decide itself, having reviewed most of the evidence myself and the additional evidence that was submitted both by Mr. Butts and Ms. Wilson-Raybould, and my colleagues will certainly disagree with me, I don't find anything of substance that was added by those two submissions. Clearly clarifications, perhaps even some innuendo, but there has been an extensive review by the committee of the people who have had something to voice. This committee has heard very compelling evidence, and it is a level of transparency that Canadians should be very happy with. My colleagues will ask for more, but
when you say compelling evidence, what do you think has been decided? So if we walk away from it now, what is the story? What happened here?
Well, Peter, the conclusion that I take from this is that you have two sides who profoundly believe that they did their jobs. Both have confirmed to Canadians that nothing illegal has occurred. But clearly what has come out of this is, as the Prime Minister has properly characterized it, an erosion of trust. And so some further examination is needed to review the roles of Justice Minister and Attorney General. Clearly you have in all this narrative no effort to distinguish those two positions when there's communication. Okay. So that would be one thing that we need to examine in more depth, but it isn't something that you can do overnight. Okay. You have to do it with some reflection and with some input.
Okay, okay, let me move to your Mr. Cooper. What's left to answer here?
Well, we haven't heard from a majority of the key players involved in this scandal. We haven't heard from Matthew Bouchard. We haven't heard from Elder Marquez. We haven't heard from Jessica Prince. The Liberals shut this Justice Committee investigation down prematurely. That's evident in light of the additional evidence provided by Ms. Wilson-Raybould as well as Mr. Butts. And the bottom line is we need to hear from all of the key players. And that's why I brought forward a motion before the Justice Committee to do precisely that. And once again, Liberal MPs doing the bidding of the PMO shut that down.
Okay, what would you learn? What do you think you would learn from those additional witnesses?
Well, we don't know, but they were all involved, and we need to hear from them if we're going to get the full truth.
All right, Mr. Blakey, what's your view on this?
Well, what's at stake, I think, is the question of whether or not Canada is a country where people in the highest political office get to choose which criminal prosecutions go forward or don't. And I think Canadians want to live in a country where that prosecutorial function and that independent legal function is hived off from political consideration. So that's what's at stake. We've heard some pretty compelling testimony and evidence offered to the effect that the Prime Minister's office was mounting a pressure campaign in order to influence what ought to be independent legal decisions. But what we haven't heard, as Michael pointed out, is that there are a number of different players. So right now, what the government wants to say is, well, you've got one version of facts and another version of the facts. There are a lot of people we could hear from that would help shed light on which interpretation of events is more truthful. And for us, a public inquiry would really be the way to do that.
Well, so give us an idea of what, and Mr. Cooper, let me go back to you and then to Mr. Miller. What are the questions? I mean, if you don't know what they're going to say, that's fair. They haven't shown up at a committee, but what are the questions you would have for some of these other witnesses that you think might, to Mr. Cooper, that would get at a different part of this story?
Well, we need to hear from Ms. Jessica Prince in terms of the conversations that she had with Gerald Butts and Katie Telford and officials in Minister Morneau's office.
But do you think she would say something more about those conversations than have already been relayed to the committee?
Well, why?
By Jody Wilson-Raybould. Jody Wilson-Raybould has given us an idea of what those conversations were.
If you have 9 or 10 people who have all been involved in this and you've only heard from a handful, how can you say that you've gotten to the full truth? And quite frankly, If the Liberals have nothing to hide, then why are they so insistent on shutting everything down, shutting down the Justice Committee, shutting down the Ethics Committee, refusing to move forward with a public inquiry, blocking the media from accessing key documents? The fact is that Canadians deserve answers, and every step of the way, the Liberals have tried to stop Canadians from getting those answers.
Mr. Miller, you want to reply to that?
Well, I'd like to go back to something that Mr. Blakey said, which reflects what I believe to be a very simplified version of what the criminal justice system is. A deferred prosecution agreement is not a get out of jail free. For 20 years in our criminal code, we've had a system by which if a company is convicted, truly convicted of a crime, the court has to take into consideration a number of things that you also find in a deferred prosecution agreement. But the basic point is not one that is political, but a concern out of the greater job that can be lost from people that have no participation into the actual crime itself. Right. If it's committed, then proven to be
Is Mr.
such.
Blakey making any? Is he suggesting? Yeah. Hang on. Is Mr. Blakey suggesting anything different than what Jody Wilson-Raybould is suggesting? Well, what has happened here? That in fact the government mounted a pressure campaign to do exactly that, to provide special treatment that the highest justice officer in your government, the Attorney General, said they shouldn't get. So she shouldn't interfere.
In my mind, the worst case interpretation of this is one side trying to ensure that the other was doing its job, all the time ensuring that the message was clear, that there was no interference, that the final decision remained with the Attorney General of Canada. That is clear in every single piece of testimony.
Right, but what's clear, and we saw it again in the text, it's clear from the text conversation with Jody Wilson-Raybould and Jerry Butts that he's provided to the Justice Committee. She's getting increasingly agitated as this process goes along, and it's hard. It would be hard to conclude anything other than the fact she thinks she was shuffled out because someone else was going to come in and make the decision that she wouldn't make.
Well, I saw no particular reference to any company in there, Peter. What I did see was a consideration for a job position, and that's a legitimate consideration. But people need to look at that piece of evidence quite carefully. And let's also go back to the committee structure. This is not a committee that has the role of a court. If it did, it would probably shut down a lot of the questions that are quite leading, and it wouldn't be admissible in a court of law.
So you could opt for a public inquiry then?
Well, look, Canadians have
Canadians
had an opportunity to ventilate this fully. There are a number of considerations that go into a public inquiry, but so far, particularly in the light of testimony from Ms. Wilson-Raybould and Mr. Butts, Mr. Wernick, there's been no allegation of any crime whatsoever. So the question then remains: is what do we invest the public money into? And is it a public inquiry, or is it an examination in depth of the roles and the erosion of trust that existed, Blakey, which don't demand a public inquiry?
Mr. Blakey, you've obviously opted for the public inquiry option as opposed to the splitting the two roles inquiry. Pick up on or respond to what Mr. Miller's been saying here about how this process is unfolding and that it doesn't really need to go any further than where it's already gone on this.
Sure. Well, the first thing I'd like to come back to is just, what else might we learn if we were to hear from other witnesses? Particularly, I think if we had a proper process that allowed Jody Wilson-Raybould to speak about the entire time that she was in cabinet, I think we might learn something really important, because even though she was upset at losing the position of Attorney General and Minister of Justice, on the day that happened, she clearly was still committed to remaining within cabinet and believed that she could. She still wants to remain a member of the Liberal caucus. So she wasn't just kind of quitting in a huff and saying, if I can't have my way, forget it, I'm out of here. She was trying to be part of that government project. So the question that I have, if she were freed up to talk about that time that she was still in cabinet from when she was fired as Attorney General and when she left as Veteran Affairs Minister, is what was said to her that made her feel that she could no longer be part of the government. And so if, for instance, the Prime Minister or somebody else said something, well, Jody, frankly, you were fired because you wouldn't play ball and you really needed to grant that DPA, that would be very important to know. Something was said to her, or something did happen between the time that she decided she'd stay on in cabinet and when she resigned. So we still don't know what that is. And in terms of a proper process, I mean, I agree with some of the criticisms of, is a parliamentary committee the right place? Sure. No, it's just the only place we're left with if the government won't call a public inquiry. So let's have the inquiry and let Parliament move on, knowing that this is going to be addressed, because the alternative is to just walk away and let a government get away with what appears to be a highly inappropriate attempt.
Mr. Cooper, let me give the final word here. We're almost out of time here, but on next steps then. If this is if you can't get it to the Justice Committee, and the government appears it's pretty clear the government's not going to call an inquiry, what happens here?
Well, we're going to use every parliamentary tool in the parliamentary toolbox. I've said that before, and I'll say it again. And in so saying it, we mean it. And that's why we walked out of the budget. It's why we had a voting marathon. It's why we are taking up debate in the House this week. And it's why we put forward our motion today at the Justice Committee. Canadians deserve answers, and this is not going to go away. The Prime Minister, no matter how much he would like to cover it up, is not going to be able to. We're not going to let him. And Mr. Miller spoke about everyone fulfilling their roles. It was the role of the Director of Public Prosecutions to make a determination on the question of a DPA. It was the role of the Attorney General to consider whether to issue a directive. And what we found out from that call of December 19th, 3 months later, was Mr. Warnock, at the direction of the Prime Minister, who mentioned the Prime Minister 24 times in the course of 17 minutes, that they simply would not take no for an answer. In other words, they didn't respect the role, and they didn't respect the decision of either the Director of Public Prosecution or the former Attorney General.
Appreciate your time tonight. We'll have to end our conversation there. We'll continue to watch what unfolds next in this story, which we're 2 months into it now. Thank you for your time tonight. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you.